Hannah descended on the field Medicae like the wrath of the Omnissiah, which is to say, flanked on either side by a maniple of heavily armed engineers and their intimidating array of combat servitors. The sentries on duty wisely let the group through, without challenge, with one of them immediately running off to go and fetch an officer. But Hannah didn't have time for that. Since it had looked like they wouldn't have to shoot their way in, Hannah ditched the Palladius engineers to do silly militarum things with silly militarum people, and rushed towards her target. Inside the smallest of the Medicae tents, Hannah was appalled to find Jim in just as bad a shape as his biometrics had reported. Every scrap of unaugmented flesh was covered with burns, and a rat's nest of auxiliary power connections were struggling to power the rest. Ignoring the crowd of Medicae fussing over Amy, as well as the pair treating Doc, Hannah stalked over to where Sarge was having fragments of bone picked out of his shoulder socket while slurrily arguing about being prescribed a beer. Neither Sarge or the medic flinched as Hannah slapped him, which is why, when she did it again with her shock field enabled. Ignoring the yelp of alarm from the collateral damage, Hannah rushed up into Sarge's face, announced that he was having his gym privileges permanently revoked, and stomped off before the confused medic could even ask what was happening. Sarge assured the man that he'd totally had that coming, and asked again about that medically necessary beer. Hannah congratulated herself on her restraint and stalked over to the combination bed workbench shared by Tink and Jim. The technophile guardsman flinched backwards as she approached, being well aware of what he had coming. But Hannah had used up her allocated period of self-indulgence. Ignoring Jim's rasped greeting over his secondary vox, Hannah immediately launched her prepared diagnostic routine. Several tense seconds later, Jim and Tink squawked in surprise as Hannah declared that the Tex Priest body was a total write-off and in need of a complete rebuild and resanctification. Hannah ignored the response and signaled her laggard escort to get moving if they wanted to hit their own deadline, before simply picking up the badly burned Jim with her mechadendrites and carrying him off to the exit. Or at least, she tried to. Hannah swore as Tink's stupid, heretical plasma multi-tool smashed into the ground, dragged off the workbench by the power cords, and followed a second later by his drone controller. There was a short pause as the guardsman and tech priest locked gazes over the fallen items, and Tink's face paled. "Oh, come on, Hannah, just give me a minute." "Don't you dare come on Hannah me! I am here as an agent of the Ordos Juris, and I am confiscating this heretical xenotech! All of it!" Hannah immediately regretted her decision as the standard-issue stormtroopers around the tent took sudden interest in the conversation. There wasn't time to change course, though, and there was also the matter of securing their new position in the Ordos Juris, so she rolled with it. Seizing a nearby gurney, Hannah piled Jim, Tink's plasma gun, and drone controller, and then the squad's quote-unquote lasguns into it. To her surprise, nobody even objected. Nobody who mattered, at least, which meant Sarge or any of the inquisitorial stormtroopers. Spinning a vague monologue about returning these to the Tau Studies facility, Hannah fended off Tink's whining and Nubby's attempt to hide his own poorly disguised pulse carbine under Doc's backpack, and secured her load just in time to be too late. Hannah swore as the Valkyrie touched down, an entire 7 seconds before the agreed-upon time, and a disorganized mob of overdressed militarum flunkies in Palladius colors. Within moments, the entire field hospital was in uproar as everyone fussed over Amy's origin as some lord or lady spawn or clone or whatever. It was all quite worrisome, and it was blocking her exit. Briefly debating the merits of just las-cutting her way through the tent, Hannah regretfully settled into a corner and checked her connection to the Orbital Defense Network for the ETA on the other incoming shuttle full of problems. Hannah was not the only one who knew about the second shuttle. The Palladius Guardsman wasted surprisingly little time for meatbags, seizing not only Amy but the entire operating theater as well as Medicaes and hauling them all off towards their transport. This invitation was not extended towards the rest of the squad, who awkwardly attempted to follow them out anyway, only to have Nubby forcefully thrown back into the tent as they boarded the shuttle. The second shuttle landed just as the first one was taking off, with Amy and the Palladian engineers. Hannah briefly reevaluated her decision not to go up to orbit with them, but she'd arranged her own ride with the third shuttle, and if she could just get out of the line of fire, she'd be able to reach it without either her or Jim being dragged into things. Thinking invisible thoughts and standing firmly in front of the gurney, Hannah watched as Administrator Tact rolled right in like he owned the place and congratulated the squad on a job well done. This sentiment rather undermined by the 2 squad of Arbidis Tact had brought with him, but the Guardsmen were surprisingly restrained in Hannah's opinion. It was probably because Twitch wasn't there. Hannah wondered if that mine he'd welded into his backpack had finally misfired, and if so, how she would be able to collect her winnings. Actually, Sarge, Nubby, and Tinkt seemed to be, if not completely at ease, at least completely resigned to getting arrested at the end of their mission, again. It was probably because of the politeness of the Arbidis treating the Guardsmen like something just short of space marines and assuring them that their laundry brig was just how they left it, on account of all the mines. Hannah chuckled to herself, then felt a pang of sadness as she wondered whose job defusing all of those would be. Tact was less deferential to the Arbidis, presumably because he'd known the Guardsmen for longer. Dropping any sense of false cordiality, he dryly informed Sarge that with the success of their mission and the rescue of the Von de Humperdinck heir, there was just the small matter of clearing our names along with the rest of Oak's minions. Tact was certain that as long as nobody started shooting anyone, he shot a grateful look over at Hannah, everything would be sorted out and no one would be executed, excruciated, or anything else that started with an X. Hannah avoided eye contact with the Guardsmen as they were politely, except in Nubby's case, put into restraints and handed over to a team of Arbidis medics, who eagerly asked Sarge how his augmetic had performed and if he wanted another of the same type. Seizing the chance to follow them out, Hannah exited the tent to find her engineer escort rushing to greet the 4th shuttle, the 3rd having quietly landed behind a nearby rock outcropping where nobody could see it. Hannah could only tell it was there because its stealth systems still recognized her as the engineer of record, since she had been the one to replace all its cogitators, not Tink. The engineers formed up in ranks as an oddly unaugmented man in Magos robes descended from the 4th shuttle, followed by a maniple of Skitari. Hannah rolled her eyes as, right on cue, an oversized servo skull zipped out and announced the formal surrender of one Magos Smith for pseudo-acts of tech heresy, to wit, being far more intelligent than any of you pseudo-scientific backwards. The rant was interrupted by a brilliant flash of light, and several of the nearby stormtroopers spun with their lasguns raised to glare at the smiling Magos and his Volkite pistol. Hannah helpfully instructed them to shut up and soldier, which got some odd looks, but kept her new boss from having to sort things out himself. She doubted she would be thanked for this. With the famous Ark heretic dealt with, the Magos Juris offered the assembled engineers, including Hannah and Jim, a ride back up into orbit. Hannah boarded the last, keeping a firm hold of Jim and her gurney full of xenotech, and determinedly not looking at the other oversized servo skull, the one that didn't have an orbital Vox relay or a holo projector built into it. She hoped she was still going to get credit for turning that crazy bastard in. Inquisitor Quericus blinked in the daylight and stared at the scene of utter devastation that he'd emerged into. Inquisitorial headquarters was a lot flatter than he'd remembered, and the bits that were still standing were mostly being kept upright by a mass of hideous, demonic flesh that had grown through half the fortress. Several engineers were being used to clear just such a blockage from the tunnel that he'd emerged from, and the smell was indescribable. With full access to his stored memories for the first time in a while, Oak was able to look at this scene of horror and conclude that it had been A, worth it, B, totally within projected collateral damage estimates based on the squad's past missions, which is to say, he really, really should have seen this coming. The Lord Inquisitor and the Death Watch captain were taking things less serenely than Oak, having emerged from the bloody purge of the conspiracy inquisitors only to find the inquisitorial headquarters literally leveled. Administrator Tact was running damage control, of course, primarily explaining that the Grey Knights had run into a slight problem involving the conspiracy's lower-ranked agents and a sudden outbreak of Alpha Marines. Fortunately, the bureaucrat had good news too. The Ordos Malleus had responded appropriately and were in the process of containing the demon as we spoke. Oak's gaze settled on the large new Gothic structure standing in the foothills below, lit up on all sides by lasfire and bolter fire. As he watched, the entire structure abruptly shuddered, the weapons fire stuttering for a moment as the entire cathedral slumped slightly to the side and began smoking. Tact assured the Lord Inquisitor that it was them finishing. Tact's explanation did leave a few holes in it, such as the fate of one noble-born guardswoman, last seen in the company of his stormtroopers. And then there was the inexplicable orcs, whose distinctive battle cry could be heard from several knots of weapon fire down below, as well as the calm chatter about demonids, and the minor matter of the tesseracts, plural, and just whose hands they were currently in. Oak didn't really need the answers to these questions, and the only person he could ask was determinedly avoiding making eye contact and generally pretending the accused Inquisitor did not exist. He appreciated Tact's effort in maintaining their mutual cover, he supposed. The discussion turned to the status of the former Inquisitorial space station in its former orbit over the world, and well as continuing low-grade battle between elements of the Inquisitorial fleet, the Guard, and everyone else were thankfully staying out of it. Oak took that to mean that things up in orbit were progressing fine without his involvement, as were the ground operations led by Inquisitor General The Rupert, and assisted by what seemed to be an entire super-heavy tank regiment. They looked like they were having fun. This involvement no longer being necessary and the resumption of his trial still imminent, Oak began the process of triaging his memories both past and present. It would be better, all things considered, if he could truthfully state that he had no idea any of this had happened. Doc groaned in recognition as he was wheeled into the Inquisitorial Tribunal and realized it was the same damn prefab courtroom as he had been sentenced to a stint in the Inquisitorial Penal Legion for flagrant parking violations. It made sense, though. These outbuildings away from the central complex were the only thing left standing, unless you counted all the structures that had been too reinforced with mutated demonic flesh to fall to orbital bombardment. It had been hastily redecorated to make it look appropriately tribunally, at least according to the squad's legal counsel, a familiar wheelchair-bound scribe. Doc hoped that the scribe's lawyering was as good as was his scribing, and nodded along as the man explained the importance of having separate desks for each of the three Ordoses, mostly to prevent fighting and kicking one another under the table. Doc supposed it really had been rigged from the get-go, in a good way. When the Arbites had hauled them off, Tact had informed someone, possibly Sarge, of the little matter of clearing our names, but the translation to imminent inquisitorial tribunal for gross misconduct wasn't made clear until Doc regained consciousness. Specifically, it had been taken until Doc had asked why they were back in the laundry brig and had been convinced that the previous few weeks of unremitted cluster fracking had actually occurred. The discovery that he couldn't move his legs was comparatively minor, and only really became an issue when he attempted to stand up to go to the latrine. Despite the fact that he'd been last to find out, Doc had elected both spokesperson and paperwork filler-outer. It was probably because everyone else could run away. The very first piece of paperwork had a note from the elderly spy. A note which nobody else had read in the 3 days that he'd been unconscious. According to Tact's note, part of clearing Oak's name included getting his minions off the hook as well. and the inquisitorial courts were being very cooperative given the sudden manpower shortage. All three of the inquisitors being assigned to review our case would be Oak's allies, and he was sending along some extra support of his own. Said support was greatly appreciated, but said allies were less so. Doc cursed his inability to kick his squad mates in the shins as the inquisitorial tribunal filled in, led by the sneering face of Inquisitor Syssitat of the Ordos Hereticus. Nubby and Tink both swore, then yelped as Sarge re-established discipline in the ranks. The second member of the tribunal was also familiar, the tall, militantly regal, and regally militant figure of Inquisitor General the Rupert of the Ordos Xenos, who cheerfully waved at the party with an augmetic arm as he was holding up a massive folio titled Charges in the other. Doc couldn't place the third Inquisitor, who was fiddling with their brand new Ordos Malleus rosette, until he spotted the man's augmetic legs. It was Inquisitor that guy, the one who kept getting arrested and had to run into Twitch's minefield. Doc wasn't sure what that idiot was doing in the Ordos Malleus now, but given the way those frackwits had handled Owen, he'd probably fit right in. Doc wondered what his name was, and if it would be rude at this point to ask. 7 hours later, Doc successfully petitioned for the first recess, something only made possible by Inquisitor Syssitat losing his voice. The Rupert had promised to keep the man sidelined until the following day, which was a massive relief since Syssitat had managed to hold 36-hour meeting with chemical and mechanical assistants. The scribe quietly apologized for the insufficient stacking of the court. He'd vetted our history with these inquisitors, and Syssitat in particular had seemed to be very fond of us in comparison to his other minions. Doc stared into the distance while silently blaming Nubby, who was pretty sure there was one to come up with the idea of doctoring that blowhard's post-mission report. Or maybe that tech priest, whoever he was. Doc wondered if he was still hiding from reassignment in the guard quarters. Either way, instead of being stacked, the court was split down the middle, with one inquisitor venomously declaring us to be the most vile incompetence he'd ever admitted into the inquisitorial service, and the other cheerfully rubber-stamping our every action and asking for the juicy details and the occasional round of aged MSEC to set the mood. This paralysis left Doc's fate and everyone else's too, he supposed, hanging in the hands of Inquisitor What's-His-Face, who mostly just seemed to be upset about how none of the incidents involved his missions, or, well, mission. Doc just had to hope Syssitat's naturally charming personality would win the man over to the Rupert side, since the evidence sure as hell wasn't going to. While in this predicament, Doc wondered just which one of TAC's bureaucratic missions had been put in charge of maintaining our disciplinary record, but he hoped that the man had died a horrible death at demon or demonid hands, or orcs. He'd settle for the orcs. But he'd hoped they had made it fucking hurt. The good scribe just grinned at him. Inquisitorial Tribunal for Gross Incompetence. Mission: investigate rumors of heresy in mustering pilgrim fleet. Outcome: cult successfully purged with minor losses. AAA notes: minimal cleanup, minor mundane collateral damage, single ship, no signs of redacted involvement. Interrogator cleared for advancement. Reprimands: disregarded orders, destroyed all the evidence, left interrogator in the brig, raised a civilian militia and got it killed, faked deaths to avoid redeployment. Tribunal charges? No charges. Mission: investigate anomalously low black ships tithe. Outcome: organized subsector-wide psycho-trafficking operation discovered. Local collaborators purged with minor losses. AAA notes: Hereticus cleanup detail requested for warp-tainted ship. Minor mundane collateral damage to local civilian infrastructure. Signs of possible, redacted, involvement, following up operation to be kept internal. Interrogator cleared for advancement, flagged as potential asset. Reprimands: see attached filing cabinet. Tribunal charges: directly violated orders resulting in the loss of valuable intelligence asset. Murder of an inquisitorial agent. Desecration of an inquisitorial agent's corpse. tampered with an official inquisitorial report. Mission: investigate statistically overperforming Guard Regiment. Outcome: discovery and disposal of psychically active heretic artifact. Regiment deemed clear of psychic influence, rotated to Minatorum Depot for rearm and refit. AAA notes: per standing directives, Magos Smith cleanup delegated to Ordos Juros contact. No signs of redacted involvement. Interrogator cleared for advancement but refused. Flagged for observation. Reprimands: official complaint from the Mechanicus for destruction of property and personnel. Official complaint from the Commissariat just on general principle. Tribunal charges: failed to return evidence for disposal. 1 warp-tainted chainsword. Mission: identify and purge Gene Stealer Cult. A. Outcome: mission aborted with heavy losses. Interrogator arrested by own team for flagrant heresy. Purge delegated to local authorities. Cult status pending. Ordos Xenos review. AAA notes: Interrogator A confirmed to be redacted agent. Integral cleanup and trace team assigned. Records sequestered. Survivors flagged for observation. See attached record B. Losses and reassignment. Asset A. Reprimands: 107 sexual harassment reports against 1 Captain Nubs. Tribunal charges: attacked an inquisitorial team, killed their interrogator, attacked another inquisitorial team, leading to the death of another interrogator using a rosette without authorization, transporting a heretic across subsector lines without permit. Mission: investigate reports of Chaos Cult activity on Feral World. Outcome: cults purged with minor losses. World cleared for reintegration and targeted recruitment. Alpha Marine recruitment operation discovered and purged. AAA notes: internal acquisition team expedited per Observer C's request. Ordos Hereticus and Deathwatch informed via official channels. Observer C's catalog of the recovered gene seed forwarded to Inquisitor Q and Analysis Team Alpha. Observer C recommends both Inquisitor R, Team G99 as potential assets. Reprimands: brought ecclesiarchy forces into an Inquisition operation without authorization. Official Deathwatch complaint over how few gene seeds were recovered. Tribunal charges: abandoned a mission to infiltrate a cultist base, necessitating an orbital bombardment. Mission: assist acquisition team with spaceship purchase. Outcome: spaceship purchased, acquisition team lost in transit. AAA notes: ship OB confirmed to already be in records and flagged for seizure. Recommended immediate review of all purchases made by Quartermaster N. Recovered psychers diverted to internal recruitment. Ship OB refit costs to be assigned to recruitment budget. Team G99 for internal review. Reprimands: Quartermaster Nubs failed to perform financial due diligence, leading to massive costs overrun. Official complaint from the Mechanicus for destruction of property and personnel. Tribunal charges: negligent loss of assigned acquisitions team, misuse of inquisitorial data and funds. Mission: recruitment and induction detail, GS-BE. Outcome: aborted due to Xenos attack. AAA notes: Planetary Observer A and Interrogator U confirm Necron Heretic and Iron Warrior presence. No redacted activity. Planet to remain flagged for observation, and records to be sequestered as internal cleanup teams to be assigned pending trace. Reprimands: official complaint from Subsector Fleet Commander for requesting a press gathering permit for a completely unaffiliated rogue trader. Tribunal charges: you sold a Necron ship to a rogue trader. Mission: investigate statistically anomalous guard desertions. Outcome: Tau recruitment operation discovered, local assets purged. Interrogator Bane Johns remanded to Ordos Hereticus custody. AAA notes: Interrogator J confirmed as nascent Alpha-class Psyker with probability warping capabilities, as predicted 3 Terran years ago by this office. Team G99 survival is exceptionally noteworthy. Recommend permanent observation and assignment to Trace Team. Reprimands. Allowed the actual Xenos collaborators to escape in favor of some sort of holodrama moonbase attack. Failed to recognize obvious signs of warp phenomenon and psychic powers in an unsanctioned person. Failed to accurately convey a captured Psyker's abilities, leading to their escape. There is no such thing as vampire orcs. Tribunal charges. Launched an escape attempt against orders, leading to deaths of inquisitorial agents. Assaulted an inquisitorial superior. Fired an inquisitorial superior at a secret moonbase as a projectile. Mission. Assigned to join Strike Force for Eastern Fringe Trace and Purge mission. Outcome. Mission accomplished. AAA notes. Embedded Observer T's extensive notes on Team G99 have been attached. In summary, Team has been inducted as a probationary asset under the Interrogator Sergeant of Observer T's acting as handler. Observer also recommends constant supervision, simplified briefings, and visual aids to be used by future handlers. Team G99 assigned to trace and cleanup mission with rest of Strike Force. Reprimands. Failed to report contact with supposedly deceased Inquisitor Lars Weebu of the Ordos. Official complaint from the Harmonicus Collective of affiliated colonies for speeding, attempting to bribe a traffic officer, threatening a traffic officer, tampering with a vehicular safety transponder, possession of prohibited weapons, assault, mass grievous assault, mass murder, assaulting an officer, fleeing a crime scene, abandonment of prohibited munitions, trafficking in prohibited substances. Tribunal charges. Aided and abetted a Xenos Galactic Powers propaganda efforts. Procured prescribed xenotech armaments and blasphemous devices, misappropriation of mission budget. Mission. Extended Trace and Purge mission. Xenotech smuggling. Outcome. Necron incursion detected and intercepted. Local collaborators purged. AAA notes. Incursion intercepted by Ordos Juris forces with moderate damage to Imperial civilian and space assets. Internal teams, Sword and Battleaxe, detached to assist Ordos Juris with cleanup operations. Team G99 to be given Strike Force command and assigned high priority acquisition mission. AAA notes 2. Observer T reports Asset A recovered, embedded into G99. Request clarification if Inquisitor Q is out of his fracking mind or just forgot about her. Clarification request forwarded to Inquisitor Q. Reprimands. Abandoned assigned mission in an attempt to steal an Eldar shuttle without orders. Possession and use of unsanctioned xenotech. Failure to recover valuable xenotech. Failure to recover intel. Failure to recover anything else at all. Ceded control of an inquisitorial operation to the Mechanicus. Tribunal charges. Triggered Xenos attack leading to the total depopulation of several majority human buffer systems, the destruction of a Mechanicus void station, and severe damage to an Imperial world. Consorting with the Eldar without Ordos Xenos approval. Mission. Assist Emperor's Scythes in acquisition of Xenos sample. Outcome. Sample acquired. Space Marine team missing in action. AAA notes. While not an official inquisitorial mission, this is presumably where Inquisitor Q's missing gene seed went. Observer T confirms this as an internal operation per Observer T's recommendation. Operation flagged as internal records sequestered. AAA notes 2. Upon re-establishing contact, recovery team requested for MIA acquisition team. Observer T recommends delegating to Lamentors and to consider the chapter as provisional assets. This is presumably where the rest of the missing gene seed went. Reprimands. Failure to report Oak to the Ordos Xenos for such a dubious mission. Failure to recover secondary Space Marine team. Tribunal charges: negligent loss of Space Marine stealth shuttle, negligent loss of Space Marines, unsanctioned acquisition of an Alpha-class Xenos Psyker. Mission: transportation of a Xenos sample. Outcome: subsector-wide astropathic blackout, redeployment of Imperial fleet assets, and significant civilian and strategic damage to Station Alumentum Primaris. AAA notes: collateral damage exceeds all projections. Observer T reports confirm redacted data leak. Official Ordos investigation inevitable. Per redacted protocol, all available internal teams assigned to cleanup effort, assets informed, observers recalled, records to be split into sanitized and sequestered versions. Reprimands: we missed your message because our astropath exploded is not a valid excuse for failing to obey an inquisitorial recall order. Unauthorized sale of Emperor Scythe's property, unauthorized trading in Xenos artifacts, piracy. Tribunal charges: negligent psychic containment leading to the loss of 32.5 sanctioned psychers, crippling subsector comms and commerce, failure to surrender to the nearest Imperial authority upon learning that we'd been reported rogue, resisting lawful arrest by Imperial authorities, theft of Munitorum stores in values exceeding 100 million thrones, destruction of administratum and telepathic property and personnel, negligent spread of xenobiological contaminants, negligent loss of sacred Space Marine artifacts and legs, wasting Imperial naval resources. Mission: delivery of Xenos samples to Inquisitorial facility. Outcome: sample delivered. Team G99 arrested. AAA notes: destination facility currently under redacted control. Seized as rogue Inquisitorial asset. Status of Magos S and Inquisitor S unknown. Presumed captured. Attempts to track and contact Team G99 based on patterns of astropathic blackouts and reports of suspected Tyranid activity have proven impractical. Reprimands: failed to follow proper containment protocols leading to demonic corruption of a valuable Xenos specimen. If there were such things as Tyranid demon hosts, you would be charged with making one. Tribunal charges: continued disruption of Imperial communications leading to mass panic and death on severed worlds. Estimated death toll to the tune of 36 million. Financial estimates are still pending. Mission: recapture of redacted occupied facility. Outcome: redacted assets purged. Facility recaptured with significant losses and damage. AAA notes: Observer T reports contact with Magos S and Inquisitor S, and confirms all redacted assets and data leaks were dealt with. Per Observer T's recommendation, external analysis teams are to interpret further intermittent warp shadows as a splinter fleet, and this report is to be forwarded to Inquisitor Q. AAA notes 2. Per Inquisitor Q, Team G99 attached to Inquisitor S for internal acquisitions mission. Observer T to return to AAA, counter redacted protocol in effect. Reprimands: for Inquisitor Sysitat's comments, see Appendices 107A through 108J. Tribunal charges: failed to submit to arrest by inquisitorial authorities. Space piracy: deliberately failed to assist inquisitorial allies, leading to the deaths of multiple agents. Aiding and abetting the wanted heretic known as the Fleshsmith. Mission: attached to Inquisitor S for internal acquisition mission. Outcome: mission abandoned without leave, moderate collateral damage to Queen and Jack Hives, redacted assets identified. AAA notes: redacted assets identified as former interrogators Angelica Dominicus and Bane Johns. Angelica was previously identified as redacted agent by Team G99 and was placed in long-term storage Facility 9, then freed in the subsequent redacted raid. Bane's presence is less explicable. Reports indicate that the presence of Hereticus research facility orbiting Harlock's wager, but there is no record of this transfer or any other record after he was handed off to the Ordos. This is why I hate them, and they deserve everything that they get. Official document. AAA notes, Inquisitor S's decision to bring in Hereticus assets have been retroactively approved by Inquisitor Q, along with retroactive reassignment of Team G99 to Inquisitor P, presumably prior to Inquisitor P's death and Inquisitor Sergeant's assumption of command. Outcome to be updated pending tribunal review. Reprimands. Official complaint from the Mechanicus for flagrant tech heresy. Error. Integer overflow. Please contact your nearest technical support chapel. For Inquisitor Syssitat's comments, see indices. See Appendices 108K 3723E. Extradition request by the Jack Hive Traffic Authority for parking in a restricted area, failing to vacate in a timely manner, 4 counts, operating a commercial vehicle without a permit, impersonating a commercial vehicle, operating an administratum courier without a permit, impersonating an administratum courier vehicle, tampering with an administratum courier vehicle, loading or unloading a vehicle in a no-loading zone, attempting to bribe a traffic officer, attempting to threaten a traffic officer, speeding, 9 counts, reckless driving, 74 counts, failure to stop or yield, 15 counts, driving against posted traffic directions, official complaint from the Adeptus Arbites for the death of officers not assigned to inquisitorial duties, 94 counts. Tribunal charges: theft of Space Marine, Inquisition, and Navy property, unsanctioned modification of an inquisitorial vehicle, lying to an inquisitorial superior, disobeying an inquisitorial superior, failing to respect an inquisitorial superior, theft of an inquisitorial rosette, negligence resulting in the sudden inexplicable death of a teammate, desertion, abduction of an Inquisition agent, theft of Inquisition property, unauthorized access of Inquisition data, theft of Class 19 forbidden artifact, aiding and abetting a chaos cult, aiding and abetting an attack on Imperial forces, and impersonating an Inquisitor. Mission: assigned to Inquisitorial Penal Legion pending tribunal review. Outcome: reassigned to Inquisition R. AAA notes: per Administrator T's order, all AAA agents not involved in counter-redacted operations have began evacuation. Administrator C confirms redacted activity targeting mundane evidence storage, requests assignment of ground and cleanup teams. AAA notes 2. Per Inquisitor Q, Team G99 assigned to counter-redacted operation, grounds team directed to lend Tier 2 support, secondary cleanup team requested. AAA notes 3. Administrator C reports success coordinating Team G99 and expected redacted infiltration, tertiary cleanup team requested. AAA notes 4. In all my years in inquisitorial service, I have never encountered a team so simultaneously oblivious and paranoid. Counter-redacted operation confirmed successful. No AAA casualties. Team G99 and Asset A successfully removed from the theater. AAA notes, Part 5. Per message from Asset A, mission only partially successful. Team G99 to be recalled. Administrator T will be assuming full oversight. Reprimands: failed to rendezvous with assigned inquisitorial contact. Failed to rescue assigned inquisitorial contact. Official complaints from the commissariat. Tampering with commissariat data slate. Disorderly conduct. Tampering with a commissariat restraint device, 6 counts. Desecrating a corpse, 6 counts. Following outdated salvage procedures. Starting a riot leading to the death of 5 inmates and endangering the life of an unspecified commissariat cadet. Tribunal charges: theft of inquisitorial property, theft of inquisitorial credentials, impersonating inquisitorial agents, transporting contraband through an inquisitorial checkpoint, interfering with an inquisitorial operation, tampering with inquisitorial evidence. Mission: return misplaced inquisitorial evidence. Outcome: Evidence lost in transit. Team G99 arrested for gross incompetence. AAA notes 1. Per Administrator T, all collateral damage, local planetary and system casualties, and assorted cleanup operations to be budgeted and tracked under internal inquisitorial disputes. Redacted, verse Quericus. AAA notes 2. Inquisitor R confirms Asset A returned and in stable condition. Team G99 apprehended per Administrator, TACT, in Arbite custody pending tribunal review. Administrator C to oversee tribunal selection process. AAA notes 3. All expenses related to incarceration, courtroom scheduling, and evidence storage and retrieval to be budgeted to Inquisitor S, Inquisitor S's asset status to be reevaluated. Reprimands. Failed to follow established evidence transfer procedures. Complaint from HQ stormtroopers for damages to chimeras and personnel. Complaint from Mechanicus over treatment of Ordos Juris personnel. Tribunal charges. Possession and transport of a redacted. Tampering with a redacted. Smuggling a redacted into a inquisitorial facility. Aiding and abetting a redacted. Unauthorized access to a secret inquisitorial trial. Unauthorized participation in a secret inquisitorial trial. Failure to assist Ordo Malleus agents. Unauthorized interference with Ordos Malleus operations. Theft of an Ordo Malleus redacted. Tampering with a redacted, leading to the opening of a massive redacted full of redacted. Using a redacted to redacted a redacted without Ordos Malleus permission. Improper use of a redacted. Improper return of a redacted to Ordo Malleus custody. Sabotage of Ordos Malleus facility. And then there's just this big black line. Tribunal verdict. 67 charges dismissed, 2-1. Charges upheld. Misuse of inquisitorial data and funds, 3-0. Procurement prescribed xenotech armaments and blasphemous devices, 3-0. Misappropriation of mission budget, 2-1. Negligent spread of xenobiological contaminants, 2-1. Theft of Space Marine, Inquisition, and Navy property, 3-1. AAA notes X. Per tribunal verdict, Team G99 dissolved. Interrogator Greg Sargent stripped of rank, all members to be reassigned and barred from Hereticus service. Per team's official dissolution, still pending legal issues, RE, Adeptus Arbites to be attributed to mission commander Inquisitor Sysitat. Former Inquisitor, former interrogator, Greg Sargent, marched out of the Inquisitor's office with the complete lack of pomp and dignity appropriate for a proper non-commissioned officer. Oak had bitched about the difficulty of arranging the demotion without having someone shot, not to mention the sheer cost in both material lives of certain boons. That was okay, though, because Sarge understood how he'd figured it all out. Oak could go frack himself because Oak was a grunt too. Admittedly, he was his own grunt, which was weird and involved a non-zero amount of invasive brain surgery by an insane tech priest, but that didn't change the raw facts. Oak was a grunt. He had his orders, and no matter how galling, stupid, and self-destructive they were, he was going to carry them out. The initial debrief had been an entirely different story. Once the farce of a tribunal was over, and Inquisitor Sysitat had grudgingly given up having them all shot, the squad had returned to the occurrence border to find Oak waiting in their quarters. Without waiting to be asked, Sarge produces the Tesseract from the half-eaten ration tin where Tubby had hidden it, and confirmed the demon's presence within. Oak had practically collapsed with relief, not even mentioning the stains and smell of 2-century-old Munitorum issue field rations clinging to the invaluable xenotech device. From there, it hadn't been hard to convince the exhausted Inquisitor to have a few drinks, and the rest of the debriefing was handled more in a camaraderie fashion. Of course, Inquisitor Oak didn't remember getting drunk and agreeing to let Sarge and Doc and Sister Valerie assign themselves to the training teams, or agreeing to the 70-page contract Amy had sent along via the Rupert, or promising Tink a ride out of the Eastern Fringe to take Theo home and collect his royalties, and especially not promising to make Nubby a frickin' rogue traitor. The stupid farce of a tribunal had taken 2 months, which meant plenty of time for everyone to get healed up, and for him personally, to get used to his new augmetic right arm. It had also allowed plenty of time for cleanup operations to restore a semblance of normality to the badly warp-contaminated planetary system. Oak had even started sending out his interrogator trainees again, and from the sound of it, they were still trying to hunt down the last of the commandos. None of that was Sarge's concern, though, because he had been deemed unfit for inquisitorial service, and he was going to frame that fucking verdict and mount it over his bunk. Anyway, with the tribunal over, Oak having agreed to the list of demands that Tact helped them all put together, with only a moderate amount of bitching, there was only one thing left to do. Squaring his shoulders, Sarge headed for the section of the Carpe Omnium general referenced as Guard Country. As Sarge passed through the incongruous maze of sandbags and stubber nests that made up the checkpoint, he waved to the guardsmen on duty and asked if everything was still on for tonight. The guardsmen, none of them Genarian, confirmed that the supply and escort details had already been sent out, and Nubby had even promised an actual guard chaplain for the service. Sarge nodded in appreciation and headed inside, navigating the lines of tents and cluster of supply depot that marked the place as a proper guard base. It was missing the mud, though, and it was hard enough getting to sand up there. And regrettably, Oak had someone actually carefully poring over their requisition orders now. The bastard. Sarge's course took him to the heart, if not the center, of the encampment. The large cargo bay still had been declared the regimental mess hall. The operations were obviously underway, the tables and seats being rearranged. Platters of actual food were being laid out and kept under guard. Sarge ignored all this, though, heading to the large wall that loomed over the main chow line and grabbing the ladder leaning next to it. Without a word to any of the confused cooks, Sarge lined up the ladder against the large collection of notes bound to wads of cash, IOUs, knickknacks, and everything else that the associated inquisitorial guardsmen had been willing to wager. The various piles stuck to the wall were organized in sections, each one sporting a name. Sarge climbed the ladder to the largest of these sections, which bore the name Twitch. From his perch from the top of the ladder, Sarge turned to face curious guardsmen filling the mess hall, and then he bellowed, "Before I get started, did anyone go insane and accuse everyone of being orcs and blow himself up with his own IED, make an IED out of an exploding blade? Somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone asks, Mars Pattern or Lucius? And then the arguing started. Sarge sighed and started pulling down the massive pile of posted wagers and passing them around the harassed-looking regimental quartermaster and his scribes. Sister Valerie. Sister Valerie, formerly of the Covenant of the Floating Daisy and currently Chief Medicae on the Genarian 99th Inquisitorial Regiment, was on a mission, an extraction mission. Technically, it was Doc's mission, but Sister Valerie had prescribed bed rest, and she'd be damned if the patient wasn't going to get it. The poor man had been tasked with rounding up all of the invitees to Twitch's funeral, which was a considerable undertaking given the size of the Carpe Omnium. Not to mention those invitees currently on the entirely different starships or planets. Fortunately, she'd been able to delegate. The few surviving members of the original Genarian 99th were guardsmen, and therefore tended to clump together with all the other guardsmen. They didn't need any herding. The prospect of free food and booze would be enough to get them all to the funeral on their own, except for those currently away on deployment. The only other guardsmen invited were the members of the Rupert's and Alfred's retinue. Or maybe it was the Alfred and the Rupert's, given who would be doing the actual work of ensuring everyone showed up. The capable Batman, now interrogator, would also be handling Miss Amelia's invitation. He had promised to pry the guardswoman off of her mother's clutches, even if she had to send the Rupert to do it personally. Sister Valerie had also delegated most of the non-guardsmen inquisitorial agents to their former diplomacy adept, who she felt owed her one, or several. Most of the non-guardsmen agents were either already aboard the vessel, like the remnants of that one training team, a few more of their surviving students, and what Doc had described as a cogbro, Administrator Tact, and his minions had arranged for shuttles for the remnants of an Ordo Hereticus team. Jim and Hannah, the inexplicably horny old scribe she remembered from her second meeting with Doc, and at Amy's request, some commissar. Jim and Hannah flew their own shuttle. The hard part for Sister Valerie was breaching the entirely appropriate quarantine that had been established around the occurrence border roughly 10 seconds after Oak and the Guardsman had departed. Fortunately, when you're a sister hospitaler, people tend to trust your authority when it comes to that sort of thing, so all she really had to do was requisition a large shuttle and go pick everyone up herself. That and try to figure out how to get that little blue Xenos through an inquisitorial battleship without anyone noticing. It was a little aggravating that all it ended up taking was a set of standard issue flak armor and helmet, a lasgun, and not a Xenos Oak sticker pinned to his chest. The annoying little Xenos had explicitly explained that he would tell everyone that he was an infiltration mission to Tau space, and the Inquisitor was kind of an asshole. It had actually been harder to try to pry old Bill and his men away from that horrible excuse of a vessel that had not been a problem with the captain or his officers or 3/4 of the crew. She did not think many of them planned on asking for a ride back. This just left the most problematic invitee: Fumbles. Thanks to Twitch, the young inquisitorial psyker had avoided exploding into demons. Psykers did that a lot. Sister Valerie had seen it herself, and so had Doc, and had been recovered from the shed he'd been stashed in before injury. Of course, that without injury had been before the Inquisition had begun their usual post-demon incursion activities and rounded up all of the demon incursion, the psykers for examination and or execution. Thanks to Oak, and especially Alfred, Fumbles had been spared examination by the Ordos Malleus, and was instead being taken to Psyker Sanctums of the Corpe Omnium. He had not come out. Nobody had listened to Sister Valerie's suggestion that he was probably happy in there, so now there was going to be Mutants' Den to pry the little wretch from their clutches. Of course, Sister Valerie didn't say any of that. She tried her best not to think about it either. The mutants could be touchy about their mutantness, as she negotiated her way past other security checkpoints and sought directions from one of the keepers. To her shock, she wasn't directed to some pitch-black cave full of eyeless astropaths. Rather, she found herself in what appeared to be a repurposed armory, populated by a trio of space marines and their attendant serfs fussing over their war gear. Only one of the 3 librarians was paying any attention to Fumbles, while the other 2 fiddled with their war gear. The hulking yellow figure stood with his psychic hood and staff over Fumbles as the young psyker sat cross-legged in a circle of holy icons, battered space marine helmets, and dribbly candles. As Sister Valerie watched, the 2 psykers did weird psyker things, which she immediately averted her eyes from in a probably futile attempt to shield her soul. After a few minutes of this, they finally knocked it off, and the big yellow space marine, with a heart on his shoulder, stomped off, cursing. Once he was properly conscious and was following Sister Valerie's rules about not touching her mind with his disgusting powers, Fumbles explained that the yellow librarian had misplaced a few of his battle brothers' souls. Not needing any further explanation, Sister Valerie groaned and asked whether they'd believed him about the poker room. Fumbles groaned back and said that they hadn't last week, or at least the week before, or before that. But she was free to give it a try. Sister Valerie was far too pious to argue with, lie to, mislead, or involuntarily sedate the Emperor's angels, so she resorted to her most deadly weapon, the truth. Chasing after the yellow librarian, Sister Valerie corroborated Fumbles' description of the horrible soul-devouring warp phenomenon that was the occurrence border. Then she volunteered to show him after the funeral, unless, that is, he wanted to go investigate himself. Once the librarian had stormed off to rejoin a Thunderhawk, he didn't seem happy, neither of the 2 librarians were willing to join him, there was nobody left to object to Fumbles going on a little walk. Keeping her expression calm, Sister Valerie led their escape from the horrid den of mutants and back into the Emperor's Light, which is to say, the main transit corridor. Instructing Fumbles to find his own way to guard country and not to explode himself or anyone else into demons along the way, Sister Valerie declared her mission a complete success and ditched the little weirdo. There was still 3 hours before things got started, and she needed to make sure that her patient's bed rest was sufficiently restful. Jim scanned the pack mess halls from the slightly disorienting height of his new augmetics, searching for familiar faces on the heaving mob of Guardsmen and Inquisition agents. Next to him, Hannah huffed in annoyance and hefted their death offering from its pallet, holding the ornately decorated and slightly radioactive cylinder out in front of her like a ship's ran. Hannah queried the noosphere for her new target and began shoving her way straight through the crowd. Jim followed behind, apologizing and continuing his search. Jim spotted Sarge over at a large table surrounded by a bitterly dressed class of guardsmen. Amy was immediately recognizable, as were the Rupert, Alfred, and Fumbles, and Hannah changed course without any prodding. Sarge, his augmetic hands carefully holding a beer, was loudly telling the tale of Harry the Baneblade's final charge. Next to him, Amy was hiding her face and probably would have run off if it weren't for her growth vat-encased legs. As Sarge got to the best part, where, I shit you not, she stood the damn thing on its nose, using the fracking turret for balance, an oddly familiar-looking older woman wearing someone else's uniform and one arm around the Rupert's neck declared that Amy had totally clinched the landing, right? Her head on the table, Amy emitted a soft groan and shook her head. The woman, Lady General von Humperdinck, according to the blatantly obvious biometric ID tags Jim could see over her head, broke down laughing, shortly joined by the Rupert and an inexplicable elderly commissar as Sarge continued the epic saga of Baneblade versus Bane Crater. As the story concluded, Amy's mother overdramatically bemoaned her child's lack of tank driving skills, and the daughter in question declared her intention to run away and join the Inquisition for real this time. She would just have to follow in her favorite cousin's footsteps and be the first von Humperdinck inquisitorial general. After a quick round of hellos and goodbyes to Sarge and Fumbles, and a bit of showing off of the duct tape sealed canister which got Sarge started on another story, Jim and Hannah took their leave. When they reached the gift pile, Jim found Doc and Sister Valerie doing their happy couple thing, making plans for the future of the Genarian 99th Inquisitorial Training Regiment, while the former captain of the Occurrence Border made his own plans for an escape back to the Segmentum fleet. Ignoring their discussions, Hannah hefted the cylinder onto the pile of eclectic knickknacks, setting it in a place of honor between Sarge's framed and signed "You Were Right" certificate and Nubby's IOU for one anti-wish. Doc waved at them, but didn't look away as the captain explained his plan to bring most of the Occurrence Border's escaping crew with him, and asked for Doc's help trying to convince Old Bill. Hannah immediately broke in, telling him not to bother, while Jim explained that he'd seen Old Bill leaving with several pallets full of quote-unquote spare parts, quote-unquote salvaged from the Carpe Omnium. The captain groaned and complained that without the old engineer, the damn Space Hulk would have fallen apart or been lost in the warp where it belonged. Jim and Hannah couldn't help but agree. Their cargo delivered and their own binaric prayers said over the offering, ashes to ashes, rust to rust, metals in bin 1, plastic in bin 2, batteries on the and other electronics in bin 3. Hannah attempted to make her escape. Blocking her retreat, Jim grabbed Hannah by the hand and strode determinedly down a gaggle of gawking guardsmen and fixated tech priests. As they approached, a blue guardsman pushed his way out of to greet them. Jim and Hannah blinked at the aggressively normal biometric data of guardsman Hugh Mann. Hannah groaned and flagged the entry for deletion, while Jim greeted his Tau friend and asked if he was excited to be going home. Unfortunately, once Few had come over, the rest inevitably followed. and Hannah groaned as her two favorite guardsmen pulled their way over. Jim fielded Tink, who was excitedly jabbering about his promised return to Tau space to become a media mogul. Nubby sidled right past them, though, to proudly stomp up to Hannah and offer her a job as the head honcho cog girl for his brand new rogue trader vessel. Hannah didn't laugh out loud. That's what the noosphere was for, and several of the other tech priests echoed their amusement. She'd been right to warn them. Pushing the disgusting little rogue trader out of easy thieving range with one mechadendrite, Hannah took a second to admire the impressive-looking document she was proudly waving in everyone's faces. It indeed said a warrant for trade, and nothing else, unless you could read High Gothic. She thought the large Possessor Debo Unum written across the top was a very nice touch, assuring Nubby that it was a very nice warrant for trade, and he was made a dashing, road trader. Hannah asked if he'd seen her and Jim's death offering, and whether Theo and Tink might recognize it too. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. We're leaving. Jim didn't fight back against Hannah's prodding, and waved cheerfully as the trio of the crowd of curious onlookers went to see if Theo could still fit in the old nuke casing. Jim had to admit she had a point, despite his curiosity and concerns about the guardsmen would get up to unsupervised. This was their chance, and as Nubby had taught them long ago, progress is the endless exchange of one problem for another. He hoped most of a Magos Juris problem involved less screaming, panic, and dismemberment. Nubby. 1 year later, the legendary rogue trader, Nubby Grot Hands Nubs, feared Scourge from the Eastern Fringe, and played his last card. It was not a very good one. The cackling laughter of damned souls echoed all around him, and a skeletal hand reached out towards his face. With a curse and a complaint that the card wasn't the same as the one he'd pocketed earlier, Nubby pulled off his grandiose hat and tossed it to the grinning skeleton across the table. It was terribly unfair, Nubby whined, since they were all too dead to even spend his money. Heavy and Cutter laughed, and the impaled scout marine just sneered, while Crisp breezily assured them that he knew a guy who knew a guy. Nubby had begun to regret appointing the charred skeletal seneschal, but the previous 3 appointees had all jumped ship, and the last had even tried to turn him into the Inquisition, the dumbass. Then he'd have thought about the officerin Then he thought about that officerin was more about, like, experiencing than, having a physical body and all, being alive and all that. And he had really needed the money. He just didn't understand why they all felt like they needed paying. Nubby missed playing with real flesh and blood people, with their own money, their bad poker faces, or really any face at all. He tried to help Twitch draw one on, but the duct tape swathed figure was barely more comprehensible than heavy. Crisp assured him that Twitch would get the hang of talking any day now, especially if they found more bits of him. Tink and Theo really should have just stayed aboard and taken up his offer of gainful and ethical employment, but they'd really decided to stay on that xeno-infested backwater. Who knew what terrible things were being done to them, even now by those untrustworthy, floral-wearing, dressed xeno-lovers? Things had started well enough, especially since Nubby had borrowed the woefully discussed Thunderhawk that had been taking up valuable space in the forward Not Fungus Bay. The owner hadn't exactly given permission, but since the librarian hadn't come out of the poker room for nearly 6 months, Nubby had been certain that he wouldn't miss it. He'd been wrong about that, but it had been at least made a good impression with the locals. Tink and Theo had been greeted by the good kind of screaming mob, along with a bunch of Tau and Hume knobs, plus all the fat dress-wearing not Inquisitors. Everyone had been real nice, and they all recognized Nubby from the horrible Tau vids, including his new hands. They even offered him a 0.05% share in the profits in exchange for his likeness, whatever that was. Tink didn't get nothing for his likeness because he weren't a girl, but he weren't going to get the surgery just to get an extra .05, so he mostly just whined about it. Weebu explained that everyone was sure his character was actually Theo's authorized self-insertion or whatever, on account of him being the one sending back all the message drones with the reports and vids and stuff. Tink at least got credit for Spot, as well as a gig working for the ex-Inquisitor as Theo's babysitter. Tink had complained about the job too, so Nubby had graciously offered the recently vacated post of Seneschal to his good buddy. Tink had said that, between babysitting Theo for Weebu or the Nubby for Oak, he knew which one he was picking. The ungrateful bastard. Of course, being the celebrity he was, Rogue Trader Nubs had no problem acquiring all sorts of deliberately heretical merchandise. He managed to cut a deal with the Tau weaponsmith he and Tink knew for a regular supply of pulse lasguns, quote-unquote, which would hopefully get Miss Lady Amelia, Interrogator Colonel, and don't you forget it, Von Humperdinck off his back. Problem was, all that sort of stuff was expensive, so since he needed a bit of extra cargo space for all the vids and merchandise that they were giving him a louis of their weird currency anyway, Nubby had decided to do a little bit of liquidating. It had been a golden opportunity. At least it looked like one. An entire planet full of suckers positively begging to buy some genuine Guard memorabilia. It was only after pretty much he ran out of stock that the stupid Xenos had started fussing about weapons laws, permits, taxes, and all of that. It wasn't like a few thousand lasguns and flak helmets or grenades were going to upset the balance of power and incite the masses or whatever, but he'd still wanted to leave without so much as a goodbye parade. Nubby hadn't received much sympathy then, and he wasn't receiving much now either. Cutter, Heavy, and Twitch all tossed him a few coins with various degrees of accuracy just to keep the game going, but Crisp immediately broke out the IOU ledger and started penning another entry. The stupid Baby Marine didn't even chip in, just flipped him off again. Nubby was this close to revoking his offer to arch-militancy just as soon as he got any other candidates for the position, that is. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of the Dive Master, Flight Marshal, Infernus Master, Master of Etherics, Master of Vox, and Enginseer Prime, Honorary. Old Bill apologized for the interruption, casually informed everyone that a horde of fungus-infested crutoids was rampaging through the forward decks, and continued on his way out of the room's exits. Nubby groaned while Crisp laughed and Twitch lurched over the large collection of diagrams mapping out the occurrence border's ever-changing layout, and began updating one of the sections. Cutter and the Baby Marine followed, surveying the prospective terrain, while Nubby groaned again, failed to get any attention this time either, and finally slouched off to go inform his passengers. One room over, most rooms were one room over from the poker room, especially for Old Bill, Captain Nubs found the librarian doing his librarianing, which was the usual crowd of Dead Space Marines milling around. The sole living Marine sneered at Nubby in his usual fashion, ignoring his heartfelt pleas for aid in these times of dire need, but several of his terminally bored, literally battle brothers, stomped off like kids out of school. Nubby ignored the librarian's glare and comments about corrupting the souls of the fallen, but that did remind him to check if any of them were those Wolf Marines or one of them from the other chapters that let you drink and play cards. And so the occurrence border continued on its way through the warp, collecting stray souls and tangling in the threads of fate like a meatball kicked under an oven. Fumbles and Amy. Interrogator Quid Eckel hurriedly moved through the corridors, guardsmen and sailors subconsciously clearing the way as he rushed to deliver his data slate. Interrogator Quid, who was not Interrogator Kid, and definitely not Interrogator Ickle Kid, tried to maintain the dignity of his newly appointed rank as he rushed through the milling throngs filling the assembly bay, searching for the Inquisitor. Really, It didn't have to be Inquisitor General von Humperdinck. There were several other people he'd rather take the astropathic message to, but everyone was busy preparing for imminent deployment. Sister Valerie was busy with the regiment's immunizations and medical briefings. Doc was in a long discussion with the 2 tech priests that Jim had supplied. Jim and Hannah and Alfred weren't even there, and most of the Inquisitor General's retinue were scouting the terrain. So, astropathic message clutched in hand, Interrogator Quid rushed to the center of the maelstrom that was the Genarian 99th Inquisitorial Regiment. The Inquisitor General was holding court surrounded by attentive guard officers and inquisitorial minions. Technically, it was actually a mission briefing, but Lord Amelia was having far too much fun recounting her previous visit to the Alimentium Primaris for it to really qualify. Ignoring the Inquisitor as she launched into a vivid explanation of Doc melting unsuspecting security guards with biotoxin, Interrogator Quid searched for a familiar, grouchy figure in battered carapace armor. Where most Inquisitors would have had a stormtrooper captain or an arch-militant or a whole fucking Death Watch space marine, Inquisitor General von Humperdinck had a retinue sergeant. As Interrogator Quid rushed up, the grizzled forever non-com spotted him and waved him close and quietly asked if the psyker knew he was leaking. Desperately trying not to blush, Fumbles nodded in appreciation and tamped down his aura before handing Sarge the data slate. Sarge groaned as he read the report, detailing the identity of all vessels in the system, along with detailed scans of the contaminated station and an astropathic invitation to tea. The invitation was from one rogue trader, Nubby Grothands Nubs, to a lovely tea and crumpet poker game, bring your own tea and crumpets, to discuss matters of quizzitorial interest, such as if I'm getting paid. At a nod from Sarge, Fumbles psychically prodded Amy, and the Inquisitor General briefly interrupted her story time before eagerly beginning to read the entirety of Nubby's invitation to the groaning audience. Letting the Inquisitor have her fun, Sarge and Fumbles put their hands together over the other astropathic message, the one that had come from the station, detailing a new wrinkle in the tactical situation. The initial matter of the psychoactive warp fungus infestation had been bad enough. Fumbles had been sure that someone had left clear instructions, probably Doc, Tact, or Jim, but despite that, things had gone rather poorly, and first the Guard and now the Inquisition had been called in. Perhaps if the Inquisition hadn't consisted of several of Oak's notorious trainee teams, assisted and transported by the Occurrence Border. As bad as all that was, though, the descriptions and images coming from the station were far, far worse. Sharing a silent look with Sarge, Fumbles gripped his psi-focus and extended his mind towards the distant station to check for himself. Inquisitor von Humperdinck broke off her readings as Fumble collapsed in a twitching heap on the floor and sighed loudly as she looked to Sarge. The non-com shrugged and hauled the young interrogator upright as the twitching faded and the psycher's mind came back into focus. In a shaky voice, Fumbles asked whether Amy wanted the good news or the bad news. The Inquisitor General just groaned and rolled her eyes. So remember that manual you wrote on anti-demonid tactics, the one that no one ever read and was branded as heretical by 2 out of 3 Ordos? Inquisitor General von Humperdinck swore, whether in excitement or anger it wasn't clear, and grabbed the data slate. As she swiped through blurry pictures and vids of ghostly insectoid forms and glimpses of a large winged creature crackling with green lightning, Sarge turned to the assembled mob and asked if they'd heard of that time Oak had sent them to live a live zoanthrope. So no shit. There we were. Elsewhere in the system, aboard a third-hand Astartes stealth shuttle, a figure in black power armor pored over the same images from the station below. Underneath his helmet, the Space Marine grinned at the sight of the smoky green figure, and after a bit of thought, changed the pattern on his single-color pauldron to a pair of crossed scythes, which he felt was appropriate. Modulating his voice and armor biometrics to fit his new role, The Death Watch Space Marine opened a communication channel to the Inquisitorial vessel to coordinate their missions. Behind him, a green cube hung suspended in a brand new control panel, procured at greatest expense from the Eastern Fringe. Message sent, the Space Marine started his approach, confident that this time there would be no escape for this so-called Frank.